Good morning again to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us once again. I see a lot of familiar faces from a couple weeks ago. If you were not able to attend last time, hopefully you did watch the recording. We think that you will find Matthew's financial analysis very enlightening and incredibly informative. I also want to thank all of our supporters for your tireless hours of work and also your generosity that has helped us support this fight in working with our Attorney General's office on protecting the will. And also we did have a financial analyst, Stefano, who did do a financial analysis for us that was quite impressive. And if you're interested in that, let us know. It is on our website, the press release that summarizes it for you. If you're not already on our newsletter distribution list, please send one of our co-hosts, either Karen or Adrian, your email address. And you can also sign up on our website. We try to get out information as quickly as possible to you within 1 to 2 weeks. And so that is a really great source of information as we continue to try to get to the truth on all matters. Let's see, so we still need to raise further funds. So if you know of anybody who hasn't given by the end of the year, I know that's a big time for me to give to all my charities. We would really appreciate any support at all to help us continue to fight this battle. There's tax deductible donations that can be made through our website. And Carlina, did you have a quick question? I see a hand raised. No?
Yeah, I just didn't want to interrupt you. So go ahead and finish what you were saying and then I'll ask my question.
Okay, great. I'd like to introduce our esteemed speaker today. He will speak about 45 minutes. He has volunteered his time. So I want to reiterate that he is not being paid at all by us. As I stated, we did have another financial higher ed expert that we did pay. And that is informative information also, but Matt is really breaking down every single financial piece of what is happening at Mills College for us and benchmarking it, which is incredibly important in all businesses to do benchmarking. And so we are just so very lucky to have him with us. Matthew is an associate professor of economics at the University of Tulsa. He actually helped lead the team to save his university. They were also struggling financially. His research includes trends in labor economics and education policy. He's published in the Journal of Public Economics and Economics of Education Review. He has a personal mission to analyze the financial picture of colleges across the country and increase awareness about peculiar spending patterns in higher education. Let's see, as you know, we are recording this presentation and we know that some people do not like to be recorded. So we will be gathering your questions in chat. If you can send those to our co-hosts, specifically Kieran and Adrian. We do have other co-hosts also. We'll be gathering those and then I will be reading those off for Matt. If you want to ask a question, please use the raise hand. That is under reactions, I believe. We ask that you only ask a question because we want to get to as many as possible. And so please refrain from making statements and please only ask one question at a time. We will come back to you if you have multiple questions. Our goal today is to have a respectful and informative discourse. I think that you will find what Matthew has to say is incredibly informative. And so any quick questions before we get started with Matt? Okay, go ahead, Helena.
What is the timeline before the deal to sell Mills is done?
So great question. We understand and we got this confirmed. We hope it's correct. It's the most up-to-date information we have as of yesterday was that the deal won't go through until the end of June. It is very fast-paced. These negotiations normally take at least 2 years. So it is quite amazing how fast this is going through and unusual. But there is the belief that it will take until June. There's a lot of hoops that they have to go through with Rob Bonta's office. There's a lot of regulatory factors, and that's not just in California, but that's also in Massachusetts. So it goes both ways in this deal being agreed upon by government entities. Great question, thank you. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Matt.
Hey, good morning on the West Coast. Thanks again for having me. I'll give you guys, I know probably a lot of you have seen the first video, but I'll give you the 2-minute spiel as to why I am talking to you again. So I've been doing education research for about 12 years. I did my dissertation on teacher labor markets and performance pay. I was really drawn to the field because I think economists can add a lot to, the education policy. It's really all about using resources to get the best possible outcomes you can for your students. I mean, there's a scarcity of resources, of course. So it's like the classic econ problem. So it really drew me in. But my initial work was all on K through 12 and Head Start programs until about 2018, when things started going pear-shaped at the University of Tulsa. They cut our retirement and then told us it was enrollment. And well, I figured, I mean, this went on for a while. I kind of took their word for it, but then I figured, well, I should probably, since I'm an educational researcher, I should probably check this stuff out, right? I mean, there's great data for higher ed. So I checked it out. Turned out the stories they were giving really didn't make sense. Our tuition revenue was going up while they're cutting our retirement. And actually what was happening was totally different. There was a huge loss happening because of the athletic department. We were also losing international students, which is actually going to be a theme you're going to see today. We've lost all of our Chinese students pretty much. And Northeastern's in a big risky spot with that same sort of possibility happening. And it's painful, I'll tell you. All right. Because they pay a lot. All right. So it's actually going to be one of the things to pay attention to in today's talk. So I started looking at the data and I found a lot of things that were really troubling, not just about my own school, but a lot of other schools. Frankly, the University of Tulsa looked a lot better than most schools that I was seeing. And it was really disturbing to me because I spent so many years working in K through 12, trying to make small tweaks here or there, help schools make changes to outcomes that, involved minor adjustments. But higher ed, to me, looks like it needs major adjustments, and there's not a lot of people that understand what's going on. Coming from K through 12, it puts me in sort of a unique perspective because I know what works in K through 12 should also work in higher ed. It also works in Head Start, early Head Start programs. So we know what a good school looks like. I mean, it's not really rocket science. You need great teachers and you need to support them. You need to keep retention up, morale up, and nothing else really seems to matter a whole lot. All right, which is if you ask a teacher, that makes a whole lot of sense. But if you ask other people, they probably would be a little bit surprised by that. It's actually one thing that is kind of surprising is the outcomes across different schools. Really, there's not a lot of difference. Once you control for the type of kids that are in a school, pretty much do the same. So there's not a lot at the school level going on. Most of the variation in student outcomes happens within a school, in a classroom, right? It's the teachers really that's driving this. So if you want a great school, you have to have great teachers. It's simple as that. And so the way to get there is you got to pay them, right? You got to pay them and you got to keep them happy. So it has a really simple implication for policy is that you put as much money as you can into instruction, which means you got to minimize your spending on everything else, right? You have so much money to get the best outcomes from your students. You really need to maximize instructional spending, minimize everything else. That's the basic principle. I know you need to do some things on the administrative side. That's why I don't say at the minimum that, it shouldn't be zero, but, and different students are going to need different kind of support services. So I'm well aware of that. But a lot of those support services actually are quite effectively offered by faculty. And I think some people miss that. It's actually really important aspect of teaching is generating bonds with your students. by hiring outside or hiring like professional mentors and things like that, you can sometimes actually have the unintended consequence of making student outcomes worse, right? So there's a lot of evidence on this. It was probably longer than 3 minutes, but basically I'm just not happy with what I've seen in higher ed. And I'm doing the best I can to try to change that. And so I did a lot of work on my own school, tried to convince them that, they had all these problems. And of course they wouldn't listen to me. And they hired a consulting company out of Chicago for a lot of money to come in and check it out. And cool thing was that consulting company turned around and told them exactly what I'd been telling them for months, right? They could have saved millions if they would have just listened to me. But the interesting thing about what the consulting company did is they did exactly what I'm doing for you guys with this dashboard, except for it wasn't a dashboard. It was just a bunch of graphs, right? And they just kind of pointed to a few things. I'm trying to improve upon what Huron Consulting did for us by giving this dashboard, making it interactive, allowing people to use it, interact with it, let it really sink in, and try to convince yourself. I mean, you can draw your own conclusions, you can pick your own peer groups and all sorts of stuff on the dashboard. So I think it's a really great way of developing buy-in, right? In fact, I didn't initially use dashboards, and maybe the administration would have believed me if they could have kind of played around with the data themselves. But that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm not getting paid, right? This is my research. I guess indirectly I get paid. I'm a research economist, so this is what my research is. So it's part of my job. All right, so what I'm going to do with this presentation is make it a little different from the last one, of course. This one's going to focus more on Northeastern. I'll rehash a lot of the main points from Mills. I tried to really simplify a plan for Mills. I mean, you can pick what you want to do, but I mean, Mills is totally fixable. There's really easy ways to fix it. I mean, easy for me to say when I'm not the one having to do it, but you can just simply reverse what they've done since 2016 and it would fix the problem, frankly. So yeah, I mean, just go back and look at what your books looked like in 2016 and do that, right? It's really that simple. But there are other ways to even do better. You can match your peer groups in a different peer groups that I'll show you, and your budget will be fine as well. And then I want to point you guys to some problems potentially with the merger. I mean, I really don't feel good about it. I wouldn't feel good about it if I were faculty at Mills. And for a couple of reasons. One is that if we lose Mills, we lose a really, really important school in this country. So I think really nationally, we need to get everybody on board with being aware of this. Mills serves our most at-risk students, and it serves them well, right? Mills is quite rich, so it can bring in low-income students, high-risk students, and provide them with a great education. Not a lot of schools can do that, and Northeastern is not one of them. They're not even close. Northeastern has a very different model. They serve rich kids, essentially, and international kids. And that's how they rose in the rankings, to be quite frank. I mean, a lot of what's in the rankings is just depending on having kids that are retained and get jobs and stuff like that. And rich kids do that quite well. But they generate all of their revenue, or most of it, from international students, which makes them a very risky kind of partner that I don't think Mills should take on. You're going to go from a situation where you're not all that dependent on tuition at the moment to being almost entirely dependent, not just on tuition, but international student tuition, which is a very risky business, especially now with COVID. All right. And I'm sure Northeastern knows that, and that's probably why they're trying to gobble you up. But I'll point to the reasons why I think it's not a great fit. I mean, there's a lot of schools that you could merge with where I would be okay with it. Yeah, it's not the best. Of course, I'd rather have Mills stick around and do its thing because it can, right? And you kind of owe that to your donors. But Northeastern is a really bad fit for merging, to be honest. And so I hope that's clear in today's presentation. A couple things I want you to take away from this. One is that Mills can survive and actually flourish on its own. It can be one of the best liberal arts schools in the country without even changing its revenue, to be honest. I mean, a lot of people want to focus on fix revenue. You actually don't need to do anything on the revenue side, and you'll be totally fine. In fact, be one of the best schools in the country in terms of liberal arts education and providing great services to your students. So that's one takeaway. You guys can do it on your own. Second one is that this merger is a bad idea. And I'll try to make that very clear, all right, in the presentation. So if you want to follow along with me, I'm going to share my screen, but you can follow along and do what you can look at what you want. Let me show you where I'm getting everything. I've kind of zoomed in so you guys can see it better this time, but there are three, let's see, I have three links here. One is the outline that I'm going to look at most. I created another dashboard for Northeastern relative to its peer institutions, and you can see that through this link. And then Northeastern has released their 2021 audit. A lot of schools have done that already. I'm not surprised that Mills hasn't, to be honest. They should, because there's a lot of information we need to get off of that so we can make a decision here. There's a really important piece of information we need to know on the 2021 audit, and that is what's the value of the endowment today. A lot of schools are posting 30% returns from last school year. That means for Mills, if they had a 30% return last year, that you're going to get about $2.8 million additional revenue from the endowment going forward. So that's like half of what you guys need to fix your budget problem. So hopefully the hedge fund guys that are running your endowment got that return, and you'd be halfway to your goal of closing your gap. My school had it. We had a 30% return. Northeastern had a 30% return. Middlebury, whole bunch of schools. So this is gonna be great. I mean, this is gonna really counter the COVID problem for a lot of schools that have big endowments. Unfortunately for Northeastern, though, they don't have a big endowments. It's not really making much of a difference at all in their operating budget. For us, though, it's the difference of what I figure, like 6 million the first year, 6 million the second year. It's like 15 million total. It's a huge difference in our operating budget, and 2.8 million difference for Mills is a very big difference as well. All right, so if you want to follow along with me, you can click on any of these, and I'm going to work off of this mostly, and then any kind of question we get at the end. If I need evidence, I'll check this dashboard or the Northeastern dashboard or the audit, depending on what the question is asking. But I want to have a lot of discussion, so I'm going to try not to rush, but I need to keep this. I want to try to wrap this up under 45 minutes if I can. So I'm going to get right into it. So there are a few key points from the last presentation about Mills that I want you guys to take home. One is Mills has great revenue. I mean, you can believe me, or you can look at the dashboard, just look at the data. It's pretty clear Mills's revenue is outstanding. Even today, after losing a whole bunch of students, Mills' revenue is beautiful. All right, the problem at Mills is the spending. The spending is bad for a couple of reasons that I'll talk about. The levels are bad and the relative allocations are really bad. To fix Mills, you're going to need about $5.4 million in additional revenue or cuts in costs, right? So you can do it either way. Probably the best approach would be getting both. And so I'll talk about how you can get there through revenue or cuts. All right, then I'm going to move into talking about, after that, I'll talk about the Northeastern deal and why I just think this merger doesn't make any sense. So we'll get there in a moment. First of all, on the revenue side, so Mills has great revenue. I know that I've had a lot of pushback actually of people saying that, no, we don't, but you do. I mean, there's a lot of ways to look at it. Mills had $63 million in unrestricted revenue in 2020. It was a weird year though. You got like $6 million from the government that you normally don't get. And you also had a bigger than normal spending policy on the endowment. So it's really the revenue that year would have been 6 less, maybe mid 50s is sort of your standard revenue at Mills. And so that's kind of what it was in 2019, 54 million. And so that's really good. Actually, it's better than more than half of private schools in the country that offer bachelor's, master's, and PhD programs. And I mean, I had a really long laundry list when I was first creating this. There's a whole lot of schools that are outstanding that have less revenue than Mills. All right. One of those schools is Agnes Scott. I guess it's right about the same revenue, but I had a whole bunch that had less. Agnes Scott, I just left them on and I dropped a bunch of the others because they are an all women's college in Georgia. They look a lot like Mills in terms of their finances, and they're getting it done. They're ranked 66th in the country in terms of national liberal arts colleges. But there were a whole bunch. I mean, I had like 7, I think, that were top 100 national liberal arts colleges that had similar or way less revenue than Mills does. So it's totally doable. I mean, you can be an outstanding college with $55 million in revenue. Just to drive it home even more, this was comparing to all 947 nonprofit schools in the country. If you compare schools that are similar size to Mills, I believe right now Mills has about 1,000 students, or at least in 2020 it did. FTE, that is. There are about 136 schools in that range, between 800 and 1,200 private schools again, and Mills is 8th out of 136. I mean, you guys have more revenue than 94% of schools your size. So again, I just don't think the focus on revenue is very helpful, although I think you can fix it, and I'll talk about that in a second. I think the big problem Mills has had for a really long time, probably longer actually than my data goes back, is that the spending has been bad. I don't know if there's like a budgeting problem. There should be there's like best practices for developing budgets. They should have a little cushion built into them. You should have regular checks throughout the school year where the faculty and the administration and the board are all getting on the same page in terms of the budget and making sure it's balanced and that you're on target. From what I've seen, and I think other experts have looked at this as well, I don't think that's happening at Mills. It probably has never happened at Mills. And it's creating problems, right? You guys are having years where you're losing money because of that. You can see Northeastern doesn't have that problem. They make sure their budget is balanced. Even last year, when it was probably a very painful year for them, they made sure it was balanced. And sadly, though, the way they balanced it was cutting a whole bunch of instructional spending. But I'll get into that as well. So Mills is just bad in the way that they allocate money. All right, that's another problem between the board and the administration. The board is supposed to check the allocations to make sure that it's matching the priorities of the school. And I can't see that that's happening, because I can't imagine that the board would look at a number where you're spending more on other stuff, administration in particular, spending more on administration than you are on instruction. I don't know any school in the world that's going to expect good results from that kind of money allocation. And you shouldn't, right? I mean, so you don't have to be an education researcher to know that that is not a good way to allocate funds. And so Mills is doing that, and you're one of the worst in the country in terms of allocating money to instruction relative to administrative expenses. Like I said before, the optimal way to do it would be to maximize instructional spending and minimize the administrative spending. But student services are not included in that, so be careful. There's a bunch of student services that you might want to invest in, particularly for the type of students Mills has. That's in a different category altogether. That's called student services. All right, median, let's see. Okay, so the median private school in the country spends $123 on instruction for every 100 it spends on administration. Mills is terrible again, 84 for every 100. I mean, I just don't, I try to imagine what happens in a board meeting when they're looking at approving the budget and they see that. I mean, maybe they don't see it. I don't know what's happening. Some kind of disconnect's happening. That should be an obvious red flag. Also, the percent of core spending, that's a pretty obvious metric to look at as well when you're approving a budget. Most schools allocate 40% of their core spending. That's everything except for like athletics, room and dorms, auxiliary enterprise expenses are pulled out of it. So you should be allocating a good share of your spending to a core spending to instruction. And you should know what a good number is. I don't think 40% is a good number, but that is the median for the PhD, master's, bachelor's schools in the country. It's part of the reason why I moved into higher ed, because I think this number is terrible. The best schools in the country are doing way higher than 40%. All right, it's not an accident that some of these schools are top 10 schools every year. They know how to spend their money. It's actually kind of funny to see schools think that they're going to get into the top 100 when they're allocating money like this, 40%, 33%. That's not going to get it done. All right, so Mills is really low, 33% of its core spending on instruction. That's not acceptable. All right, and finally, as you've probably heard me say before, the administrative spending is just far, far too high. It's somewhere between $5 and $9 million too high per year on administrative stuff. All right, just administrative stuff. If you fix that, you're in great shape. And actually, Mills was always high on this, but in 2016, they weren't incredibly high like they are now. Believe it or not, Mills has increased its administrative spending throughout this whole crisis. I don't know if people know that, increased it by about 2.4 million throughout this whole crisis. At the same time, they've been cutting instruction like crazy. Again, that's not a winning strategy. And frankly, that faculty aren't just completely outraged by this is sort of beyond me. This really is something that should have been addressed years ago when you saw this happening, or board members should have addressed it. It's not right. All right, so to fix Mills, it's actually not all that complicated. Only need about 5.4 million. That's actually the structural deficit at Mills is like 3.4 million. If you take the average loss in net unrestricted assets for the last 4 years or so, excluding 2020, which we actually made a profit in 2020, it comes out to about 3.5 million that you're missing out, you're losing every year. And then, like I said, every budget should have about 3.5% cushion built in. So that total with the cushion would be about 5.4 million that you need to get back on track. I did mention, though, it could be a little bit low because I know some years the Mills closed the gap a little bit with some weird things like selling assets. So I'm not really accounting for that here. There could be, the structural deficit could be a little bit bigger than what I'm talking about. I don't think it's much different, though. As far as I understand, there's only like 1 year or so that they sold assets, but I could be wrong on that. We can talk about that in the discussion. Okay, so we can fix it. All right, it's totally fixable. 5.4 million on a $57 million revenue, or 55-ish, is not actually a bad deficit. That's less than 10%. We were at TU, we were dealing with a bigger deficit than that. It's done. I mean, we've already fixed it in 1 year. Okay, so one way to fix it, this is actually kind of a gift from the stock market. Hopefully it holds. You guys got to get a hold of your 2021 audit ASAP, because you need to look at the section that shows it's called endowment net assets section. Look on there and see what your endowment net assets are at the moment. They probably grew by 30% last year, unless you have a horrible investment management firm. Okay, I mean, which is quite possible, but check it out. If it did do that, you're going to get about 2.8 million more per year, every year, assuming the gains hold, for revenue. So that's actually more than half of the gap that you need, all right, just free, coming from the stock market, and the big endowment that Mills has. How did I get to the 2.8 million? It's pretty simple. 30%, you guys have a $187 million endowment. If it grew 30%, and then you take 5% of that appreciation, that's what you get for operations. That's 2.8 million every year that you get for free there. At our school, it's been awesome, man. We're gonna get like 15 million, as I mentioned, perfect amount to like do everything that we want to do to make the place better. Okay, so outside of that, that's not really a strategy. That's just check what your endowment's going to give you. It's probably going to give you a lot more money next year. I do have a couple strategies to fix Mills. One is you can reverse, I think, the enrollment losses that have occurred at Mills. It's actually a pretty catastrophic thing that happened suddenly. It was, you lost 50% of your applications in 2015, and it never recovered after that. It was always 50% lower than it had been for decades prior. So that's a problem. It was never addressed. I don't know if maybe people just didn't know it happened, or there's some, maybe there was an effort made. It just, when I'm looking at the data, it looks like nothing changed, and you continue to get the same 50% lower applications every year since 2015. So there's like a snowball effect that occurs with that. Every class that graduates is going to be about double the size of the class that comes in. So in about 4 years, you're going to have about half the students you had 4 years prior. And that's exactly what happened in the data. Actually, there was some compensation, though, by admitting more students. So not all of the 50% loss in applications was translated into 4 years later a 50% drop in students. It was more like a 30% drop in students. Still pretty catastrophic, but I think it could have been fixed immediately if you just would have figured out why the applications dropped and go back to the old model. Could be something really simple like a marketing campaign, or flyers. I don't know. That could have been something really simple that changed that had a dramatic effect on applications. So the simple fix is to go back to what you were doing before. All right. I've heard people say that there's a change in demand for mills, or there's a change in demand for women's colleges, and they're just not feasible anymore. I don't think that any of that's supported by the data. Particularly in point B here, mills demand looks strong to me. The only thing that changed was that steep drop in applications, one-time thing, and it hasn't changed since. If it were a change in demand, I would expect that you'd have changes happening in all sorts of areas that are related to demand, like your retention rates, your yield. Yield is the percentage of kids that are admitted that actually show up in the fall. That's great. It hasn't changed. No change in retention rates either. No change in per student tuition revenue. Kids are paying quite a bit to come to Mills still. So I don't see any indication that there was a sort of demand shift. I suspect it's mostly a blunder that occurred that affected marketing or recruiting, and the demand is still there. It's just not being sort of harvested efficiently. The second point I wanted to address was I checked it. Is the demand for women's colleges lower? So the way to check it is to do like a simple diff and diff estimate, it's called. It's really simple approach, really. Let's just compare women's colleges to co-ed colleges. And so what I'm using here are the 14 women's colleges that are on the dashboard. They're all pretty similar, right? So we're holding everything constant except for one of the groups here is women's colleges. And then I'm comparing to the other 20 schools on the dashboard that are co-ed, except for Northeastern. Northeastern's on the dashboard, but they're not at all like any of these schools. So what you do is take a look at what happened to the change in women's college demand. So you see that women's college enrollment decreased by about 6%. That may say, okay, that kind of supports the idea that women's colleges are not doing great, but you need to compare that to the counterfactual to if they were co-ed. If those schools were co-ed, assuming they would have had the same trend, the women's colleges would have experienced an 8.3% loss, not a 6% loss. So the conclusion here is that women's colleges are actually doing better than the co-ed colleges. And to me, this is convincing or strong evidence against the argument that women's colleges just aren't feasible. In fact, they're probably a better model than being co-ed, at least if you're small, right, as this group of schools is. Okay, so I don't see anything there about like, Mills being not a feasible thing. There's lots of demand. There's great donor support. I just think there was a blunder that happened that caused 4 years of pain, and should be now pretty stable actually, because every class that comes in is the same size again. So you're at like what we call a steady state. All right. So I have a strategy as well. So one strategy is to fix the admission or the applications problem. Another strategy is cut costs, right? Pretty straightforward. And where you cut costs first, and if you can, only area you can cut costs, you should start at administration because of what I said earlier. All right. It doesn't really matter for student outcomes if you have an excellent administration. They don't care, right? They're still going to have the same outcomes. So you want to try to minimize the cost here on the administrative side. You can see all of the items that are in these groups, but administrative spending I define as institutional support. That's all of your upper administrative people, the VPs, the president, the provost, business office, accounting, audit folks, you got it, right? Upper administration. Also some things like security, anything that's universal to the whole institution would be an institutional support. Not anything to do with teaching kids though. All right, academic support does have some things that are touching kids, but again, it's a lot of your middle management administration. It's your dean's offices. Sometimes schools put their provost folks in academic support as well. So you can be aware of that. That's another reason why I add them together. Academic support is mostly middle management. There are some things that you might not really think of as administration though, like the library would be included in academic support. So that's about the only thing that's not administration really in academic support. Everything else, you got like IT folks, you've got middle management, deans, and and their staff, all that's going to be in academic support. Also, like professional advising would be also an academic support. Okay, so that's again somewhat gray, I think, because at least they're dealing with the students, right? It's not like purely somebody in a back office, right? But some of that's in there. There's a mix in the academic support. So I think you just need to cut this stuff. You need to cut it. And there's a number of ways you can do it. And it's not going to have a big effect or any effect at all on your students, to be honest, based on years of research that people have done. Pretty confident in saying that. Another thing you can do that's not going to affect your students is cut your food contract to a reasonable level. It's really out of the stratosphere in terms of what you guys are paying for your food contract. And I went through that in detail in the last presentation. You can save 1.8 million if you just switch to the vendor that Holy Names is using. All right, so here are the policy options I have for you to fix your budget problem. As I said, you're probably gonna get 2.8 million from the endowment. One thing you can do is just go back to the administrative structure that Mills had in 2016. If you did that, you'd save $2.6 million. You heard that right. Mills increased its administrative spending by $2.6 million since 2016. I mean, to me, that's just unexcusable. Again, why the faculty are not like freaking out, I have no idea. Our administration did not do this and we freaked out, right? They tried to cut instruction and leave administration alone, and we said no. All right, and in fact, our administrative spending was off the charts, just like Mills. All right, so if you just did that, just go back to what Mills did in 2016, you're looking at 4.4 million in savings per year, plus the additional revenue from the endowment. You should be in good shape. You should have surpluses every year. I mean, assuming that you can also get a handle and stabilize. I mean, I think the enrollment is stable at the moment, but there are some weird things that have happened since, right? Like announcing you've closed doesn't help enrollment. But you could go back, reset back to 2016, and it should be good. But there are a lot of better options. I mean, if I were in charge, I would do something a lot more aggressive. As I said, if you're really aggressive with it, you can get close to 10 million out of administration and invest more in student services and instruction first. And then, you know, if students need more counseling, health services, better career services, you could afford that, right? I mean, right now you can't because you're spending all this money on other stuff that you don't need. All right. And a good administrator would do this, I think. Take this option, match the spending of your peer group, same size peer group. There's 11 schools that are the same size on the dashboard as Mills. I have between 800 and 1,200 students, and their spending on administration is $8 million less than Mills, right? It's not even adjusted per student or anything like that, $8 million less. Fix the food contract, voila, you have almost 10 million bucks plus the 2.8 you're getting from the endowment. You're in great shape to push your instructional spending way up, all right, well beyond what Northeastern is currently doing, all right? It could be one of the best schools in the country if you took that route, in my opinion. All right, totally doable. Okay, so that's it on the Mills side. I mean, why this wasn't done a number of years ago, again, I can only speculate, but you know, there are a lot of things that happen on these school boards, especially higher ed, that, you know, people just don't look for the right things. Maybe they're not asking the right questions. They don't know what a good number looks like because they're not doing this benchmarking. That's why this benchmarking is incredibly important. You're not going to know if your instructional spending is low or high unless you compare it to your peers or your aspirant schools. And so I don't know if Mills has been doing that. I mean, if they were doing it, they probably would have known this a long time ago that they had a problem. Okay, so why am I against the Northeastern merger? I think actually in my first conversation with somebody from Mills, I was kind of like, I created the dashboard, but I was like, well, I mean, at the time I thought Mills was going to close, and then they announced the merger with Northeastern, which sounded great. I mean, I didn't know much about Northeastern, but I knew that, you know, it's a highly ranked school, good reputation. But I've looked into it and I'm not a fan of Northeastern now. And there's a lot of reasons why. They act more like a for-profit school than a top R1 school that they're sort of lumped in with, right? They don't look at all like the schools in their peer group, not anything like the Carnegie class R1 research university. They don't look like that at all. R1 research universities are rich typically, and they don't charge their students a lot of money to attend them because they're rich, right? They want to bring in the best students in the country. They want to serve poor students. They want to serve everybody. And they dump money into instruction like crazy and research like crazy. Northeastern is not doing that, right? They're not anything like that group. Why they're considered in this group, I'm actually kind of curious, and I'd like to start talking to people that lump them in that group. Because they don't look like that, right? Northeastern has a tiny endowment. They rely almost entirely on tuition revenue to support their operations. That's fine. There are a lot of schools out there that do that, but they're not research one, Carnegie classification, doctoral universities typically. There are a lot of schools that depend on tuition and run just fine. The problem I have with Northeastern, though, is that they're not relying on domestic student tuition to run their operations. They're relying almost exclusively on international student tuition, which is a super risky business. In fact, our new president just said that if we do end up getting international students back, we're not going to spend that money because it's not reliable. The reason that Northeastern has not been hit hard by, like most schools in the country, by losing almost all of their Chinese students or all of their international students in general, is that Northeastern is ranked 55th on the US News. And for most international students, that's all they really care about, and especially the Chinese students, for a number of reasons related to the labor market there. So they haven't been hit like everybody else with a loss in international students, but if they are, which I think they will be hit eventually, maybe soon actually, they're going to be in very big trouble. And sadly, it would be like Mills thinking it's got a savior and actually end up in a situation that's far, far worse than they've ever experienced. So I'd be really sad for Mills if this went through and then what I think is going to happen happens. It'd be really sad, actually, because that would mean the end of Mills completely, and not even Northeastern at Mills, I think, would survive that. So let me explain why. Okay, so first of all, 73% of revenue for Northeastern is coming from tuition. That is extremely high. To put it in context, the median four-year private school is 58%. Mills is 31%. That's excellent. That's where most of the best schools are, really low reliance on tuition, because that affords you the opportunity then to act like a nonprofit, right? And that's the point. You can serve the students that you want to serve, and Mills wants to and should serve poor students that can't afford and should not have to pay a ton of tuition. All right. And so Mills can do it. You can do your mission with the resources you have. The thing that scares me about Northeastern merging with Northeastern is Northeastern can't afford to do what Mills does. Northeastern can't survive serving low-income students, high-risk students like Mills does. It's not going to work out for them because they need the tuition money. Mills doesn't. So again, they have a really small endowment. The reason they're still relying on tuition is their endowment's tiny. They only get $2.5K per student from the endowment. That's really small. They also have not great donor support, only $6,000 per student coming in from donors. And you can see that Mills's numbers are way higher, $9K from the endowment, $10K from donations. It's just that's the story. Mills doesn't need a huge amount of revenue from tuition to operate quite effectively. All right, so the thing that Northeastern is doing is they're charging a really high tuition to typically wealthy kids or international students. And if you actually figured it out, which I did, I was kind of curious. Northeastern is like the most expensive school in the country. Let me just show you the top 20. Yeah, they're sixth, but there's some weird schools above them. I mean, I don't know what this SIT graduate school is and these others. I mean, really the schools I know about are Middlebury, Pitzer, and Bates. And then it's Northeastern, 45K per student to come to Northeastern. That's just tuition. That's not even room and board. That is, it's outrageous. And it's a lot higher than the top schools in the country, right? Like UPenn could do that. I mean, they're kind of doing it already, but you don't even see Harvard on here, right? MIT, USC. There are a lot of schools that are better than Northeastern that could charge 50, 60K to their students, but they're not doing it. Why are they not doing it? You should ask that, right? I mean, they're not doing it because they don't need the money and they want to serve their students, right? They care about their students, all right? That's probably what's happening. Northeastern is running a very different ship. It's a for-profit kind of enterprise. The other schools probably realize we're a nonprofit, right? We want to help our students. We're not going to charge them $60K, even though they're willing to pay $60K, right? Well, what's the point of being a nonprofit? You're going to do that. Might as well just be for-profit then. All right, so that's disturbing, and I just wonder if Northeastern is going to get themselves into trouble, because there's a growing movement to counteract this trend in higher tuition and unsustainable student debt. And, you know, enemy number one then is going to be a big school that charges a lot of money, and that's Northeastern. So I just wonder if they might have some political problems in the future. But actually, I checked it out. They're not actually charging domestic students a whole lot to attend the school. They're charging less actually than their peers for domestic students to attend, which tells me, based on Northeastern's track record, it tells me that domestic students don't really want to spend that much to go to Northeastern, right? Because if they would, you can bet Northeastern would be charging them that. So that's concerning. It seems like the demand for Northeastern is not all that great from domestic students, but it's very high for international, which is really a product, again, of that high ranking. A lot of these international students only care about the ranking and will just pick the school that they get into that has the highest ranking. So that brings me to the next point. They're really reliant on these international students to come in. They're 32% of their enrollment, but that's actually quite deceiving because that's a head count. Head counts are very different than full-time equivalents because a lot of students are part-time, right? It turns out domestic students are part-time mostly. A lot of them are. International students tend to be full-time. So really their FTE is a lot higher than 32% international. You should ask them that, right? I mean, you guys need to ask these questions if you're going to merge with Northeastern. You should know what you're getting into. Ask them, what is the international student FTE percentage at Northeastern? It's probably way higher than 32%. That's a headcount percentage. Okay, so I really don't like that number. That's one of the highest numbers in the country. And not only that, you're combining a really high dependence on international students and a high dependence on tuition. Puts you in a really risky spot if you're Northeastern. If you start even lose a few international students, you're going to be scrambling to recover. The reason is the international students pay on average about $59K. I didn't ask Northeastern for this number. You should ask them for it. It's probably different than mine. It's probably actually higher than mine. The way I backed this out was from a regression of tuition and fees on the headcount of domestic and headcount of international student enrollment, some year effects and school effects. And it spits it out that if NU adds, well, I used all the schools in the sample, so NU is probably more because it wasn't very precise when I just used NU, so I needed to use the whole sample. So on average, schools in the sample, which was all the schools on this Northeastern dashboard that I created, it's 30 schools. 31 schools. Revenue goes up by about $59K when a school adds an international student headcount, right? When they add a domestic student, the revenue goes up by about 10.6K. So at first you might say that can't be right. I mean, really, a domestic student paying 10.6? Well, you got to keep in mind that that's not necessarily a full-time student, right? So the big difference comes because international students are almost all full-time. They're more likely to take summer classes, which is going to be factoring into the net tuition revenue as well. And they almost all pay sticker price, right? Nobody in the US pays the sticker price unless you're a multimillionaire. And even then, you're probably not going to pay the sticker price at a lot of these schools. So the folks that do, though, they're the international students typically. And full sticker price at a school like NU is Northeastern, I think, is close to 60K, right? Or over 60K. So yeah, that's where that's coming from. So what this means is that, I'll try to wrap this up really quick so we can have a long discussion, is more than 70% of their tuition revenue is probably coming from international students. And then since 75% of their total revenue is coming from tuition, that means that more than half of Northeastern's revenue is coming from international students alone, tuition and fees, not even the room and board, not even considering that. Right. So it's probably a lot higher than 50% of their revenue coming from international students. So I use that as like a lower bound to do some stress tests, although I think it's probably a lot higher than 50%. You should ask them, how much of your revenue comes from international students? Talking tuition, fees, room and board. How much comes from international students? They should have that number, and they probably know that number, and that's why they're acting bizarre in bizarre ways. It's not good. So what does it mean? It means if they lose 20% of their student or international students, it's not even domestic, just international, their revenue will go down by about 10%, 30% drop, be 15%, 40% drop would be a 20% drop in revenue. So you might be wondering, is that big? I mean, should we be worried about a 20 or 15% drop in total revenue? Well, I think so, right? I mean, people freaked out at Mills for what's happened there. Mills's drop in revenue was 12% if you take it from 2016 to 2019, 12%. So a drop in 20%, it looks a lot worse, right? And in fact, Mills's revenue is higher in 2020 than it was in 2016. So again, it was a weird year with the COVID relief, 6 million there. So I'm not even taking that in, you know, I'm not going to use that. It's not really fair comparison, but so really, I think a fair comparison is to say, you know, Mills lost 12% of its revenue. That was painful. Imagine a 20% loss in revenue, how that would feel. That's probably what Northeastern's looking at in not too long in the future. All right, international. So here's why I think the 40% drop in international students is not only possible, but actually quite likely. International student enrollment in the US has been dropping for quite some time, even before the pandemic. Again, Northeastern's lucky because they have that really high ranking. So what's happened is the students have just funneled out of the lower ranking schools and stayed in the top ranked schools. So they haven't really felt the pain from that yet. Thankfully, you know, lucky for them. But you know, if Northeastern slips in the rankings as they have as of late, they can expect to lose all of their international students like overnight, like we did. But there's other reasons. Even if they maintain their ranking, we have a pandemic, as you guys know, and travel restrictions, visa restrictions, all of those things are going to be putting a lot of pressure on international student enrollment in the US. And on top of that, other countries in Asia are developing their higher ed sectors very rapidly. I mean, you can see it every time I go to like try to hire faculty. There's Chinese universities competing with us, and they offer a lot of money. Very tempting. And so there's this a lot of pressure happening on international student enrollment, which is again probably the reason why Harvard, Yale, Princeton, they're not jumping on the bandwagon like Princeton or like Northeastern's doing, right? They know it's really risky business. Northeastern's just been lucky so far, but I think the luck's about to run out, to be quite honest. And you should at least know of this risk, right? This risk is very real. So here's the deal. If Northeastern's hit with a reduction, which a lot of schools have, like I said, our school lost all of our international students. And nationwide, we lost about 70% during the COVID, although it's kind of COVID pandemic's coming back a little bit. Northeastern, it seems, where it was able to weather that first year. I'm guessing they did online. The reason I say they weathered it is I saw their 2021 audit, and I have it on the dashboard for you. It looks like their tuition revenue stayed pretty constant. So that kind of surprised me. I thought I was going to see a very different result, but they must have been able to hold on to their international students, at least for now. But I wouldn't count on that continuing. A couple of things. They're probably doing online courses, which online courses, if you didn't know, are horrible. And students just don't learn a lot. They're not as valuable, not nearly as valuable as being in person. So I doubt they're going to pay $60K to do online schooling for very long. Maybe that's like a 1-year deal, right? Until they find a better option. Another thing is, just watch the news. Over 40% of Northeastern's international students come from China. One change in diplomacy or one shock to that relationship, and boom, overnight, Northeastern loses over 40% of its international students. Then you have the catastrophic event that I just described. They're going to lose over 20% of their revenue. And that's going to be it's going to be very brutal for them. And it'd be even more brutal if you guys joined them, because they're probably going to cut their satellite campuses first, right? Which would be Mills on the chopping block immediately, right? If that happened. I don't know the arrangement in the deal though, but my guess is they've got some way that they can sell the Mills assets. I'd really love to be proven wrong, but I'd imagine if there's a financial emergency, they've got some kind of clause where they can sell assets. Look very carefully at that. That might be the reason why they're interested in this deal. Also, is that endowment going to go to Northeastern? Like I said, their endowment's tiny. They need a bigger endowment. All right, so it's going to be a lot more painful than anything Mills has ever experienced if they do in fact lose 40% plus of international students. Okay, a couple other things I noted on the audit. Take a look at this. Northeastern, I think, is already kind of feeling the heat. They, for the first time in any of the years of data that I have for them, I've never seen this happen actually. Northeastern increases their instructional spending every year. Every year it goes up. This was the first year, 2020, where it actually fell, and it fell substantially. Almost $36 million reduction in instructional spending. At 7.4% of their total spending on instruction. That's worrisome. I'd be worried about that if I were a faculty member. You can go back and see what Mills has been doing. That's a substantial reduction in instructional spending. I'd ask them about that, right? What was that about? What's going on? And I've also I saw some things online where they've got salary freeze. I'm not sure, and hiring freezes. You should check on that for sure. Know what you're getting into. Another thing to take a look at is their domestic enrollment is not great. It's actually decreasing throughout the time span I'm looking at. The thing that's counteracting that though is their international students have increased. And of course, as I just mentioned, the international students are the ones that are paying the bills. So it hasn't really damaged them. The thing that's really concerning about it is how is domestic student enrollment decreasing when they've added all of these campuses in the last 10 years? They added Charlotte, Seattle, San Jose, San Francisco, and Portland. Yet their domestic student enrollment is still lower today than it was in 2011. That's really concerning because again, it kind of supports the idea that domestic students don't really care much for Northeastern's product. Again, watch for the sharp decrease in international enrollment. That's going to be catastrophic for Northeastern if it happens, and I think it's quite possible. All right, that's it. I want to have a long discussion now. I know I went probably an hour instead of the 45 minutes, but we have lots of time. I'll stick around and answer you guys' questions to the best of my ability as long as you're on the line.